Tonight on Revolutionaries.
I was the paper boy in Palo Alto at the homes where Steve Jobs used to live and Larry Page lives today. So that was the beginning of my journalism career.
Three top technology writers, Stephen Levy of Wired magazine, Facebook effect author David Kirkpatrick, and Pulitzer Prize winner John Markoff of the New York Times, have seen it all in their 30 years covering technology. Here they talk candidly about everything they've seen at the revolution. Major funding for Revolutionaries is provided by the Intel Corporation.
Since this evening is a little bit of a retrospective as well as a look ahead on the careers of these very distinguished journalists, we're going to start with a little bit of a walk down memory lane. We have John Markoff on the left, we have Stephen Levy in the middle, and we have David Kirkpatrick on the right. We'll get them to talk about each one of these photographs in a minute, but we only thought turnabout was fair play. The host has to have a picture as well, so we're going to look at my picture now. That was the summer of 1980. I just graduated from college and I was about to go to work as a journalist for United Press International. I almost looked like I knew what I was doing there. So that's me. Now let's go to the next set, which is Stephen. You're there in the front, and this is a very famous event. So talk a little bit about what you're doing there.
I was attending the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970. Come on, yeah. Jimi Hendrix. It was actually, we didn't know at the time it was Jimi Hendrix's last performance.
Got a tie-dye T-shirt there.
That's right. Yeah.
You didn't buy it at a store, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I didn't. It was the end of a summer of doing Europe, which people did, back then in the summer off.
That's terrific. And the next one is of you in the picture we saw earlier. Now, what exactly is this?
That is my office at the time. A friend of mine, bought a building, and he was going to make his apartment, like a big multi-floored, complex. And until he did that, he rented me that room for like $200 or something like that in the best block in New York, between 5th and 6th in the Village. It was around the corner from where I lived. And as you see, I have just the latest in technology. There you see the paper from the dot matrix printer out there. And of course, I had cable management totally under control.
That's great. And the next one is also of you with someone quite well known. When was this taken?
That was taken probably in the late 90s with Bill Gates, of course, and I was following him around when on his book tour there. I think we were headed to the Today show there.
That's Manhattan.
Yeah.
Okay, and then one final picture of you and Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah,
when was this taken?
This was taken, probably earlier this year. I somehow went to Zuckerberg mode this year. I wound up interviewing him several times. And I think in this one, people are there. He might be telling me about graph search there. They gave me a little advanced look so I could write about it when it came out.
Yeah, I remember that. All right, good. John, you're next. Are you ready?
Oh, dear.
All right, here you go. Now, you're in a Giants hat because you're a local guy.
Yeah, I went to a game at Seal Stadium, actually. So I'm that local.
All right.
Yeah. And, I'm a true Blue Giants fan. As a matter of fact, I played on Y.A. Tittle's Little League team in Palo Alto.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Were you a Cub Scout?
That's a story I can't tell here. I was actually thrown out of the Cub Scouts.
Because that's a Cub Scout belt.
It is a Cub Scout belt. Good eye, David. All right, the next one up is a very different look at John Markoff. About when is this?
So that was probably 1972.
Okay.
71 or 72. I was in the Trinity Alps in Northern California, working for a Palo Alto backpacking camp, actually. Camp Unile, a wonderful place that still exists. So,
and then the next one I really wanted in there because I found this wonderful clip of you talking to Stuart Chaffee. This is about 1995, I think, and you're explaining to us what this new thing called the internet was. Do you remember that?
Oh, I do. So you're not going to play it. That's good.
No, we're not going to play the clip.
Well, the irony about that clip, well, first of all, I got totally dinged for name-dropping Steve Jobs' name because he was in my mail queue.
I remember.
And nobody knows that nobody cared about Steve Jobs in 1992. He was, but the other sort of terrible thing is this just went viral about 3 weeks ago, and about 10 times as many people saw it this time as they did when it was originally.
What are you saying?
I was explaining this thing called the internet and how I used it in my work.
What year again?
It was 92.
92, that's right. I think I said 95, but it was 92.
Yeah.
And you did say, to your credit, you thought it was going to be pretty important. That's great.
How'd that thing work out? Yeah.
All right, now, David. David, you're not going to escape from this. So this is,
Oh, God.
you're the tall guy in the back. Talk about this.
Well, that's my little brother, Tom. And I actually used to want to be a herpetologist. I was very into reptiles and amphibians when I was a kid. This was in College Camp, Wisconsin. No, actually,
Good training
this
for
is
Silicon
actually
Valley.
not. This is in Kansas City, actually. We used to go to College Camp, which is on Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. But that was a turtle I'd found somewhere in Kansas City, and I was, I guess, terrorizing my little brother with it.
He looks terrible.
He looks terrorized, he does.
I must have been about 10 there, something like that.
And what's the next one?
I don't know. Oh,
That's,
that's probably me. Probably my freshman year of college. Could have been my sophomore year.
we all had hair issues
I wasn't the
at one
happiest
time, I think.
Yeah, well, you know, it was so that would be 72-ish.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Great. And now today.
Yeah, that was last year at our Detroit conference. We have good T-shirts at Techonomy.
I can tell. That's a nice one. That's right. That's your Techonomy tee, isn't it?
Yeah, we have a bunch of T-shirts, but that's my favorite one.
All right, good. So now that we're all sufficiently warmed up and everybody is taking all of us a lot less seriously, let's begin. So I want to talk a little bit about your early days of your career. And the first thing I want to ask you all, and Stephen, let's start with you. Who was the editor, the person who first said, yeah, we're going to put you on this beat about technology?
Well, no one said they were going to put you on the beat about technology. I was writing for Rolling Stone there. They didn't have a beat about technology.
Yeah.
What happened was, actually, I credit it to Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda had a film production company, and she hired an editor named Susan Line, whose job it was to get magazine writers interested in writing about different stories they might make a movie out of. So she came to me with the story. She had been talking to some computer people to do a story about these people called computer hackers. This is in the very early 1980s, and I had never touched a computer before, and certainly never heard of computer hackers. Most people hadn't. And when I did the story, I was just totally fascinated with these people and that world, and decided to write more about it, and wrote about it for Rolling Stone, and then other magazines, trade magazines in the computer world, and just kept going.
And was there someone who said, yeah, we think this is really important early on, or were you just writing it and because it was something you were really interested in?
Well, the people here all thought it was important, and then it was my job to convince the people in New York where I was writing that it was important. And they were starting to get it. They were interested in it. But there were very few people who were professional writers who were addressing themselves to that issue. And then from the computer magazine side, they were all getting ads and they were getting some money. And they said, wow, we want to switch from being hobbyist magazines to magazines that hire professional writers. So I found work there too. I did a column on telecomputing for one of the magazines, Popular Computing. So I was actually writing about getting online in the early 1980s. Of course, I was getting online with a 300 baud modem. So you read the articles very slowly.
Yeah.
Really, it seemed miraculous at the time.
Yeah.
John, how about you? 1976 was early to be
Yeah, although
doing
if you want to
this.
go all the way back, I was the paper boy in Palo Alto at the homes where Steve Jobs used to live and Larry Page lives today. So that was the beginning of my journalism career. I like to say, there goes the neighborhood. But I dropped out of graduate school. I ran my college newspaper in the Northwest, and I dropped out of graduate school in '76, and I came back here and ended up working for a small alternative news service called Pacific News Service. And the neat thing about PNS is, although you got paid nothing, I think I got $100 an article, they were picked up by about 300 papers around the country. And so you'd write something and it would be everywhere. You'd be in the Sunday Washington Post, the Sunday LA Times, the Sunday Chicago Tribune. So it really looked like I knew what I was doing. And I parlayed that ultimately into a job at a startup newspaper, computer newspaper in Palo Alto called InfoWorld, which was sort of growing up with this hobbyistic phenomenon that was about 5 years old. The Homebrew Club was here. And InfoWorld, when it first started, it had been something that had been started by Jim Warren, the guy who started the West Coast Computer Fair. He had called it the Intelligent Machine Journal. It was bought by a guy named Pat McGovern, who ran IDG. And he turned it into this weekly, the first news weekly of the personal computer industry. But we really initially thought we were either going to be sort of the Sports Illustrated or the Rolling Stone of the personal computer industry. We couldn't make up our mind which, and then it ultimately sort of it tried to become the Business Week of the PC industry, at which point it was time to leave.
And David, how about you?
I mean, how did I get started, right?
Yeah, how did you get started in this?
I'm much more junior in the field than these two guys, although we're roughly...
Thanks, David.
Roughly the same. Well, you consider me that way, yeah. Well, is that what you said? I don't know.
No, he was thanking you for...
But thank you for whatever. But, I mean, they're role models for me. I started first writing about tech in '91, January of '91, and I was at Fortune, and interestingly, I was drafted to do it. Nobody wanted to write about technology in 1991, in early '91, partly because PC was considered boring at the time. Technology was considered a very complex and scarily confusing field that really, there wasn't any payoff to be a journalist about it. Our only tech writer had quit to go to, I think, Information Week. And I had written a couple of articles on technically related subjects, particularly on the health effects of electromagnetic fields, which came out of the fact that I'd been writing about managing. And there was a lot of concern about what was happening to employees. Initially, sat next to cathode ray terminals, TV screen type things, because the radiation might be damaging them. And then that got me interested in writing about the health effects of power lines and cell phones. And those, I guess the cell phone article might have come later, but I'd written a couple of these pieces that were thought by the editors of Fortune to be sort of sciencey, and I kind of had handled the complexity of it well enough that when they needed someone to cover tech, they said, well, you could do it. And I said, but I don't want to do it. And they said, well, you only have to do it for 2 years. And I said, okay. And then so I got a commitment that if I didn't want to do it after 2 years, I could go back to covering management or something else. And that was just such great timing, because the beginning of '91 really was the beginning of the sort of age of technology we're still living in many ways. The flourishing of technology really began with Windows 3.0, in my opinion, which came out in August of 1990. And really then that led to the World Wide Web and a lot of other things. John's laughing. Is that because you disagree?
No, that was 2 years before I stopped covering the internet.
Yeah, there you go. No, but I mean, but the fact is, yeah, well, you were a pioneer. I had no clue. But it was a very lucky time to get into it. And so by the time 2 years were up, there was no way they were going to take me off the beat. And it was, the rest was just fun. It's still fun.
What was the first thing you wrote that either made an impression on you that this was important or going to be important, or one of your editors said, you know what, this is really important?
Well, I don't know. There were so many stories, but the first big piece I wrote in the Beat was a piece comparing the U.S. to other regions in their prowess in technology, and I looked at, I think, 10 fields, semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing. I don't know whether mini computers was one. There were a whole bunch of optical technologies, and I actually ended up giving a letter grade, I think, to each of the three major regions, Asia, US, and Europe, on each of these fields. And the feeling at the time was that Japan was about to overtake the United States in tech, and that we were at risk of losing our preeminence. And I was very gratified in doing this very thorough research project to end up giving more high grades to the US and convincing myself that Japan wasn't about to take over for everything, and it turned out not to be the case. But it was a great intro for me, memorably, because I got to really methodically look at a whole bunch of different parts of the industry in one story. And I think that I might have taken 4 months reporting that. That's the kind of thing that doesn't happen anymore. magazine stories like that probably barely exist anywhere,
Yeah,
sadly. now.
yeah. We're going to talk about that in a minute, about how things have changed. John, how about you?
Well, in the 70s, I remember being involved in a 5-part series on the societal impact of the microprocessor. That was pretty early. At InfoWorld, well, so let's see. The other early thing that sort of had a big impact on the world, I wrote an early article on the Strategic Defense Initiative of the Reagan administration, and the headline writer at PNS actually put the phrase Star Wars on it because, and that was the first linkage between SDI and Star Wars, and because of that, it got a tremendous amount of attention because it was just obvious that that sort of was where the Reagan administration was going. And then when I got to InfoWorld, there are a whole series of things, but the first thing that really sort of got picked up by the national press is that people had begun lugging Osborne computers onto airplanes, and they were using them. If you can imagine what an Osborne would do to the tray on a, and so I got some guy to put an Osborne in an anechoic chamber, and of course it was giving off RF all over the place, and it was stepping all over the landing beacons, and so it raised the issue of, which is still an issue how many years later, electromagnetic radiation and airline safety.
So you're the one that led to us all having to turn off our stupid
Electronic devices?
I actually don't know if there's that connection, but it's possible.
You're gonna.
Gee, thanks, John.
Really?
It's still an open question. So very early on at Mother Jones, I had a small freelance article, which may have been the first article about cyber war. This is probably 78 or 79, and I discovered there was a back door from the ARPANET to Moscow. And at that point, it seemed like a kind of humorous thing, but it actually had enough impact within the Reagan administration that they killed the funding for this poor little math institute called IASA in Vienna, because they were the modem, at this point they were up to 9,600 baud, modem link between Moscow and Vienna.
Now, how did you discover that?
Some guy in the ARPANET community told me. I was a very early ARPANET user as a journalist. I wanted to get access to the ARPANET because there was a mailing list called HumanNets. It was a very sophisticated discussion amongst technologists about the impact of the technology. And at that point, if you could find your way to a ARPA tip, which was at Ames, there was no password protection at all, and you could connect to it, and then you could get to MIT AI, you could get an account. So this is probably 78 or 79, I had an account just so that I could read HumanNets.
Wow.
I just remembered something that I have to say. I haven't thought of this in many years. I first started using email with MCI Mail in probably 91-ish, early 90, right around the time I started covering tech. And a friend of mine who was sort of in the tech industry was trying to convince me to go on email, and I was like, why do I need to be on email? I mean, what am I going to do with that? And this person said, John Markoff is on MCI Mail. And I was like, oh shit, I better be on it then. And I did. That was the thing that got me on it. So I'm telling you, you are a role model.
Well, it reminds me that, the Times thought nothing of electronic mail. And so this would have been before 92. Bill Gates came to the New York Times and had one of these editorial meetings. And during this meeting, he told the editors of the New York Times that he ran his corporation with email. And that freaked out the New York Times. And so it was a front page story in the New York Times because this guy was actually using this thing that they'd never heard of to run their corporation. Of course, the New York Times wasn't using it. I had for a while a Next at the Times. This would have been 89 or maybe 90. And I was running NYT.com as a mail server on that machine. And
you were running it?
I was running it, yeah. And I, at a certain point, offered NYT.com to the New York Times many years later, actually, probably in 95. And they turned it down because they said, well, people would confuse it with New York Telephone. And so I kept using it, which was a company at that point. And I kept using it.
So you got the rights initially?
I had a 3-letter domain name, yeah. But
this is before the web. Most people here may not realize.
It was before the web. It was before a lot of stuff. But I didn't even have a web page. So if you went there, you got 404. And finally, about a year later, they came to me and they said, can we have that domain? And of course, I made the mistake of giving it to them. The deal was that if I gave them the domain, I'd get to keep my
job.
Well, yeah.
Well, you are still still employed, you know. The New York Times, you know.
So about every 2 years, some systems guy cuts off Markoff at NYT.com, and I have to go remind them that we struck this deal, which is kind of a mixed blessing because it probably gets more spam than any other email address.
If you kept that, you might own the New York Times right now. Stephen, let's go with you now. The first story that you wrote, I mean, you reeled off a couple there, but what was the first one that really made you think, wow, I think I'm onto something here?
Well, that first one about hackers, and then I did a book about it that came out in 1984, and doing that, the exciting part was kind of talking to these people at MIT who invented hacking. They invented computer culture, and it was a totally untouched story. It was like stumbling upon a lost city in the jungle somewhere, and like everything's preserved, and I'm talking to these people for the first time. And that was kind of amazing. And then there were other things. As I started writing for computer publications and switched my sensibility there, the computer industry wasn't really used to people coming in and treating them like things in the outside world are. I did this review of the PC Junior, which is a computer that IBM did, and I said it had the smell of death about it. And IBM did not like that. and they had never had anyone write something like that in a magazine, which actually charged money and was sold in a newsstand. So they went insane on that. And then, but probably during those first few years, probably the story that had the biggest impact on me was I did a story for Rolling Stone. I convinced them to let me write a story about this computer that Apple was about to release called the Macintosh. And at first, I thought Apple would be so thrilled that Rolling Stone was going to do a story about their new computer, but they said, we don't know if we really want it. As it turned out, that Steve Jobs didn't want us to do the story unless he was on the cover. And he actually called up Jan Wenner, the editor of Rolling Stone, and said, I got to be on the cover. But he eventually backed down, and I went in there, and I remember it was like one day, in particular, it was a couple months before the computer came out. I went to the headquarters there in Banley 3, just down the street from where they are now, where they were building the Macintosh. And I saw this computer, which I knew was going to change my life. I knew it was going to change everyone's life. It was bigger than Windows 3, David. Yeah, it was Windows 3, actually.
Actually, it was physically bigger, but it wasn't nearly as important in the history, at least of development.
Well, we could talk about that.
I'd love to.
I have a feeling we're going to talk about that.
And then,
I'm not a partisan of Windows, by the way.
So then I met these amazing people on the team, some of whom turned out to be my friends to this day, close friends, or kids all grew up together. And then at the end of the day, I went out to dinner with Steve Jobs. It was the first time I met him. And, we had an amazing interview. Got testy at times, but he told me his whole philosophy of design and, said, if this doesn't work, maybe I'll go to Italy and ride a motorcycle. And it was the beginning of a long-term relationship with Steve Jobs, which, continued till, he died.
When you first heard those visions of his, what did you think?
Well, I thought, this guy's like got the biggest ego in the history, right? But on the other hand, I just saw the most amazing machine I'd ever seen. And I met the people there who one moment would curse him for making them work so hard, and then dismissing their work with the horrible words, and then they went back and did something amazing, and then and they were having the time of their lives essentially building this thing, and so I had to be impressed with what he was doing there.
Was it apparent to you from the very beginning that the cultural impact story was as big as let's say the business story?
Well, when I was doing Hackers, I saw how much all of this was a cultural story and a political story, and politics in the same way we thought of politics in the 1960s there. What I found, that even though the hackers themselves weren't talking in a political sense, the way they worked and the way they thought and the way they viewed the technology had political impact to it. That's why I'm lucky enough people are still reading Hackers today, because the fights about intellectual property, who owns these things, and what should people be allowed to do with these things, and and the essence of Silicon Valley now, as well as the hackers saw then, is about doing what you can't do on a computer. And I thought that that's the story, really. It's not a technology story. It's a human story.
Yeah. John, you were almost literally growing up with it at the same time, right?
I
here
was
in the
thinking
Valley.
about my sort of Macintosh aha moment came about 6 years. I mean, it's sort of, you get these insights that change the world for you. And for me, it was actually from this guy by the name of Ted Kaler. I was working on the board of directors of that summer camp, and this guy shows up who's decided the world's going to end and that he has to do something about it. And he wants to create a time capsule and put all knowledge in it and bury it somewhere. And he heard about this summer camp up in Northern California, and we thought, well, this is a great deal. We need somebody to dig biffies on our property, and then he can put his time capsule down there, and it'll be there forever. And Ted Kaler was one of the young kids who was part of the Alto team. And so as a result of meeting him, he lost interest in building his time capsule, but I got to see an Alto. And seeing an Alto in '78, I suddenly saw the future of computing. I mean, nothing would ever be the same again as a writer and as someone who's interested in networks and things like that. You know, it was the future.
So there may be some people here who don't know what an Alto was. Can you just talk about that?
Alto was a research computer designed at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center by a small group of people led by a computer scientist by the name of Alan Kay and funded by Bob Taylor, who's a fellow now this year. And it's thought of largely as the first modern personal computer. It had a window display, it had a mouse, it was networked, all the things that we've come to use. And Alan really thought of it as an interim Dynabook. He had this notion of something that's sort of like a slate or a portable computer that he was trying to get to, and it was a step on the way to that path. And once you see that, it's so obvious that that's the world's going to be, and it just, you know, it's that Paul Sapphoism, never mistake a clear view for a short distance. I mean, it took a little longer than I thought to get there, but it was pretty obvious where the world was going right at that moment.
Yeah. And David, the cultural implications of all of this.
I love the way you're taking the conversation. First of all, I never was really a tech writer the way these two guys have been, although I think they've both done a lot of different things, all of which I've read. But I've been more a business writer and writing about industry stuff and competition between companies more, I think, than either of these have, although Stephen, especially with the Google book, and he's done a lot of that. It's not really what you do, write about competition per se, although you get into that through the technology window a lot. But, I had been writing for Fortune for some time before I had this, drafting experience. And, frankly, business people are pretty dull. And I probably wouldn't have stayed at Fortune much longer, to be honest. I was kind of bored and also annoyed with the kind of personalities that I was having to deal with writing about DuPont. And, some of them were interesting, but a lot of them weren't. So I had no idea what I was going to experience when I started covering tech. But, actually John's book is very important in helping me understand why I have thrived so much as a tech writer, because he explains in his book, like nobody else ever has, how the whole seeds of this explosion of the last 20, 30 years comes from a lot of the same impulse that the 60s grew out of, this idea of the empowerment of the individual, power to the people, freedom, of, the ethos of the 60s really motivated the builders of the PC and all the things that came after it. And I'd say Zuckerberg is completely in that heritage, by the way. And I am one of these people who's always been very much a power to the people kind of guy. I was a hippie, and I didn't realize that there was a strand of business that actually was comprised of a lot of those people. And once you start, even though Bill Gates is kind of a jerk a lot of the times, even he didn't do it to get rich. And that one of the really odd things about the whole industry is these people who got the most rich of any human beings in history, almost without exception, did not go at it to get rich at all. And Jobs most notably, but a huge swath of these people were really trying to change the world for the better, coming out of this set of values that John articulates and explains so clearly. So for me, I think once I started covering tech, and I realized what, this idea Microsoft had, which was obviously something we all covered very extensively, even in '91, for me, a computer on every desk and in every home was a transformational idea. It was a radical political idea. And it has had radical political implications from then until now. And this is one reason, by the way, I think that Macintosh is nowhere near as important as Windows because it just wasn't used by anywhere near as many people. And Microsoft did successfully promulgate their technology in a way that really did deliver the vision. And then the web was built on top of Windows primarily. And I think Facebook in some ways was the next fundamental step forward. There have been plenty of other phases, but one of the reasons I love Facebook so much as a company and was so happy to write about it and still think it's so important is because this idea of transparency and giving people this power to reach out as broadcasters is really so embodied in the whole business idea. And that's what fascinates me about the industry, and that's what I've tried to point out without actually in Fortune. Fortune was never interested in that aspect of it, by the way. She always had to kind of hide that.
I'm not going to engage you on the Mac versus Windows thing, but what you said reminds me something else about Bill Gates. You said he didn't want to make money. My sister's a sociologist, and she always was bugging me because she has this theory that everyone in America basically thinks they're middle class. That even no matter how rich you are, you probably think you're middle class. You don't want to say you're rich. People in America don't like to admit to that. And she always kept asking me, ask Bill Gates if he thinks he's in the middle class. Ask Bill Gates if he thinks he's in the middle class. And I would say, I'm not going to ask Bill Gates if he thinks he's in the middle class. And then one time I interviewed him, and I thought, oh, what the hell? So I didn't say, oh, do you think you're middle class? I said, Bill, you grew up in the upper middle class, and, of course, you're pretty rich now, right? But you sometimes still think of yourself as middle class. And he said, yeah, I kind of do, I mean, so my sister won.
But you don't disagree about the money thing, do you?
I actually have to. I mean, I think,
do?
yeah, I do. I don't think you can discount the greed gene. To me, I think it's wrong to say that Steve Jobs wasn't motivated by desire to get great wealth. And what actually set many of the companies of that generation apart in Silicon Valley was this mixture of a guy like Wozniak, who really did have no intention to get wealthy, with a guy like Jobs. And it was putting them together that was what was so unusual. And I think Bill wanted to get wealthy, too. I mean, I wouldn't give these guys total pass on...
No, they weren't passing up
They were
money.
capitalists.
But I think that wasn't what was the driving force there. I think you'll agree with that. It was, they were excited about making money. They did everything they could to, assure that they were making money. But I think that, Bill Gates, that was his passion.
He was one of the most avaricious business guys ever in America.
No, but that was not for money. He is a very hardball player. Anybody would agree with that. But it was never in order to make more money. It was to win. Bill Gates is the most competitive.
They always said that, but I thought that was self-serving.
He is so competitive.
They said, oh, the money's just about keeping score. Yeah, right.
No, look, I also, no, you know what I think happens with this kind of wealth is there is a phase shift that happens. And it's happened to Zuckerberg, definitely. At a certain point, you say, oh my God, I really can be rich. And then you start wanting to get more. And I mean, you start competing with money. But whether it's not, I'm not saying they don't want to have the money at all. But the fundamental motivator, especially for Gates and Zuckerberg, both of whom I know quite well or have spent tons of time talking to, I really don't think money is nearly as much of a motivator. In Gates' case, it's especially power. And in Zuckerberg's case, it was really this impact thing. But now there's no question he wants to be richer than Bill Gates. That has happened.
Bill Gates is, getting less rich because he's giving away billions of dollars to philanthropy. Maybe you see a bad dark side.
I've been in Bill Gates' house, okay? I mean...
No, he's a consumer. Look, let's face it.
But it's not like he's living a simple living kind of lifestyle.
No, but I want to jump in here.
When you have $50 billion, it can be a modest experience, and it still feels pretty extraordinary to you and me.
Talk about the Internet of Things, which everybody seems to be talking about right now. What do you associate with that?
Can I start with that?
Please.
Since I have an entire event on that tomorrow.
Okay.
Techonomy, which is my company, has something tomorrow called the Techonomy Lab, Man, Machine, and the Network. And it's really about the Internet of Everything, which is the phrase we prefer for it. I think it is sort of the next big transformational phase in technology because of the sheer amount of data that's going to be produced and the unbelievable set of opportunities we're going to have to create decision-making and control on top of that data. I have no idea what all of it will amount to, but I'm certain that it will be transformational. Because really, you almost are going to get to the point where you can look around and see anything in this room, and it quite possibly can have intelligence in it or connectivity in it that could allow it to communicate with other things in this room, other things in the world, with us, things we wear. I really am excited about it, and this is why for Techonomy, it's the first time we've ever done an entire event on one subject. And so that's a big shift.
Well, my association
and
is
it's tomorrow at SRI from 3 o'clock to 5:30, and you're all welcome to be there, and love to have you come.
Yeah.
So my association is with June issue Wired magazine, because this week our cover story is on the Internet of Things.
Okay.
Good timing.
So, I mean, you know, everybody sort of
I could outplug you if you want.
like,
Please, let's.
and I'd
At
like
least
to
we're in
plug.
the right area.
I'd like to plug Mark Weiser, who is the Xerox researcher who coined the idea of ubiquitous computing, which I think is what we're talking about here. And
Yeah.
to me, it's the, you know, everybody talks about innovation in Silicon Valley. There have been a couple of big ideas that the Valley feeds off of. One was personal computing. The Valley fed off that for a long, long time. And ubiquitous computing is that kind of an idea. And that, to me, it is sort of the flip of personal computing. The computer disappears into everyday objects and they become magic. And that's what's going on right now. And the first guy to get it, was Steve Jobs. You know, with the iPod. I mean, I think that in some ways was the first ubiquitous computing device.
Although Weiser was talking about it long before that.
But I'm talking about who was able to take it and translate it into a successul commercial product. And you know, then what was the iPhone? It was the telephone becomes this magic thing.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing. That you know, we're going to work through every object around us in the world, and they're all going to become magic.
I remember Mark Weiser at Xerox PARC one time. I was interviewing him, and he picked up a 6-pack of Coke, and he said, "There's going to be a computer in each one of these." And I was like, what the hell is he talking about? I really didn't have a clue, but I remember it. It was a very striking comment.
Yeah, sometime in the 90s, around the time Bill Joy was doing Genie, which was going to connect everything like that, we were doing a story on it for Newsweek, and it was going to be a cover because we did these specials on technology every so often. And I begged the people in the cover department to dummy up a cover with a dishwasher on the cover. And the headline was, will your dishwasher be on the internet? And our editor, who was a great guy, looked at it and said, not a Newsweek cover. So I have the printout that they dummied up for me, actually in my office now at Wired.
In your years of reporting, who was the most persuasive person you met, the best at selling his or her ideas you've ever encountered, and how did that person do it? David, you want to start?
Well, I'd say if any one of us doesn't say either Jobs or Gates, I would be surprised because, I mean, all three of us know that these two guys knew Jobs quite a bit better than me, but I knew him fairly well. I mean, both of them Gates is still amazing at selling his ideas. I would have to say it was Gates, probably. But you know.
As a persuader, I'm not sure, they had such different styles when you would interview them.
Totally different.
Can you describe it?
Well, when you went to interview Steve, basically you had to play defense. It was like, you had to go in there like rope-a-dope, because he would just come at you, pow, 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 and you would have to, basically sort of divert the conversation from where he was taking it there. With Bill, sometimes he would sit back and have you come at him. Then he would, when you show your vulnerability, he would go at you there. And sometimes, he had this little game he would play sometimes, a couple games. One of his, he would sometimes go totally silent if you ask him a question that he didn't like. I remember the first time I interviewed him about the browser war. I did the first story on the browser wars. And we had just come from Netscape, and my editor, for some reason, decided to come along with me on the trip or something. He heard some good restaurants in Seattle. So he accompanied me to Gates' office, and he couldn't believe what happened, because I started off in this long introduction. Well, Bill, we just came from Netscape, and they have this browser, and they say it's going to be, the operating system of the future, and blah, blah, blah. And I finished my question there, and it does end in a question. How's Microsoft going to come back? And he just sits there. And he's sitting there. And he's sitting there. And I'm thinking, I've only got an hour with this guy, right? And so finally I said, well, while you're considering that, but the amazing thing about Bill is that you have to listen incredibly carefully during an interview with him, because sometimes if you get too involved with the clock or getting all your questions asked, you fail to say that he's answering what you want, but not in the way you expected there. And sometimes he'll circle back to that question he didn't answer 20 minutes later and give you a very succinct answer there. Yeah.
So the difference between Gates and Jobs is Gates was one of my most enjoyable interviews, although it was the most confrontational. It was entirely intellectual, in a sense, impersonal. He could tell you that that's the most stupid idea in the world.
Oh, he said that like every interview, at least twice.
But it was all intellectual combat, and
No, he threw a pencil at me once.
you got under his skin. But Jobs, it was entirely personal. And in a sense, even though I had this great respect for Jobs, interviewing Steve Jobs was the thing I liked least, because of that sort of highly, he would walk out on you, he wouldn't show up. We got into this rhythm when he sort of started rocking and rolling when he returned, where it was this game where my goal in going into one of these interviews was to get one quote that actually was off message. And mostly I failed. He had something he wanted to communicate, and it was on his terms. I did get to him to say that taking LSD was one of the 2 or 3 most important things he did in his life. And I got him to say that nobody read books anymore. But that was about it. He was a control freak, and I hated that. It was a struggle.
But Gates, you felt like you could spar with.
Gates now actually is totally different. Bill, when he was off the record, had this eviscerating sense of humor, and he is a very funny guy. But when he was on the record, he would be careful of what he said, very measured. Now you talk to him, and he's just having fun. I did an interview with him recently for our 20th anniversary issue. And I always try to throw in something he's never heard before. And I saw on his website, he just comments on a lot of books he's read. There's about 50 books on there. There's only 2 novels, and one of them was Catcher in the Rye. So I decided to ask him, I said, Bill, do you identify with Holden Caulfield? And he gave...
It's a great English major question right there.
Well, yeah, he asked for it, he put it up there. He gave an amazing answer. He said, well, not really, but on the other hand, wait a minute. I named my daughter Phoebe, he went into this long thing, like Catcher in the Rye. He remembered everything about it, which freaked me out. And he said, and I probably, if I were him, I would have left my hockey sticks on the subway too. And so he remembered that? Whoa.
Interesting.
But I want to correct myself, because I actually do think there's only one other person I know who compares to those two, and that's Zuckerberg. I really do think he's in the league. And actually, in the end, I found his vision more compelling, which is why I wanted to explain it in detail. And I think he's still extraordinary at expressing the passion that drives what he's doing at Facebook. So
his interviews have gone up amazingly since
he is amazingly
since he started.
Passionate and articulate about what he's trying to do, in my opinion.
What technology, here's another audience question, what technology did you write about that you thought would be a world beater or a gee whiz breakthrough that actually never turned out to be that at all?
That's interesting.
John, you're smiling.
I'm drawing a blank.
Okay.
It's sort of...
We don't want to think about things like that.
You guys you're like Dick Clark, you only write about the hits, right? That's.
I once wrote an article for Rolling Stone, a column. I did a column for Rolling Stone in the early 80s. And I wrote it about this cable channel that had just come up, the Weather Channel. And I thought it was the stupidest idea anyone ever thought of. And the headline I gave it, When It Rains, It Pours.
That's very good.
A year ago, I got the Google Q onto the front page of the New York Times because it was made in America, and it lasted about 2 weeks.
Yeah.
That was pretty embarrassing.
Well, I mentioned how I was really excited about groupware in the 90s, and I was totally wrong. It totally died. I learned a lot by writing about it. I've written about so many things that I got excited about and turned out not to matter, but I've forgotten about them also, unfortunately. But it's happened many times. I will concede that. But I don't like to think about it in the shower.
So first of all, we haven't talked about security or privacy, things you've all written about extensively. On the security question, who is going to win in the war for internet security? in the end? Is it going to be kept secure? Is it going to be the people who want to break it down? What do you believe about that, John?
This is the expert right here.
Yeah.
Well, no, I walked away from this a year ago because I just sort of had it. After Lusek and Anonymous, I decided if I had to write about one more testosterone-poisoned young man with an attitude, I was going to have an aneurysm. It was just time. It was time to do something different. It was Groundhog Day. But I think that what has made me pessimistic about the security
Pessimistic.
question. Yeah, very pessimistic actually, as it's become an instrument of state power, statecraft, state intelligence agencies, and if we ever had a chance of securing these machines, now that the states are using them for their own means, all states, 100 nation states have active cyber war programs, I despair at ever building a meaningfully secure ecosystem. I don't see how it can happen.
The question that came up from the audience was really about the privacy battle between the individual and the corporation. But John, it sounds like you're far more worried about the privacy battle between the state and the individual.
Well, I was trying to say that coming from both, the individual is under attack from both directions, little brother and big brother. Just the degree to which these companies that we report on are building their business models on systematically violating our privacy is stunning to me. And every time I think I've seen everything that's possible, there's a new layer of invasiveness. And people, we have a generation of people who don't think about it the way we do.
I would not say it the way. I'm curious if, Stephen, you wrote a book about Google. Do you think they built their business model on systematically violating our privacy? Would you say it that way?
Well, I know they didn't think of it that way. I think that
That's part of the problem.
the question is, what are the boundaries there? What are the if you say I'm giving my permission to use all these, this unbelievable amount of information to help me have a better experience there, that's the ideal, and that's what Google would say, I think, is the ideal. But then there's this other level, which is very common in the industry, which, and this isn't, in Google's case with so much with search advertising, but the degree they're in display advertising and other things like that, and some of the things that are mixed in, with the social things, where there's, tracking, and I think just routinely, not just Google, with many, many places, there's tracking that takes place that I happen to feel that regulation should limit that, the voluntary, restrictions just aren't working there, and you need not only regulations, you have to enforce the regulations to do that, and we're not seeing that. And I don't think try to get something like that done in Congress in a sensible way.
Yeah, dream on. That ain't gonna happen.
Yeah.
One of the real tragedies of the industry that we know fairly well is that there's almost no one in Congress who knows it fairly well. Maybe 5 people in the House and the Senate combined would be able to talk even in this conversation and even know what we were talking about. It's pathetic how disconnected Washington is on balance from the realities of the pace of change, the internet's significance, the subtleties of the business models. I just don't, I feel as bad about those Washington people as I do about the Wall Street people. Really.
Well, yeah. Well, and as journalists, we have to say what the government is doing. They're subpoenaing the records of AP reporters.
That AP thing is really horrible.
Which I find horrendous.
Horrendous.
Yeah, well then look at the behavior of the Bloomberg reporters. To sort of cut it against both ways. That was just a start.
Let's also not leave out other countries, because the U.S. is not singular in its governmental ignorance about tech. I think there's really only one country that really gets it, unfortunately, and that's China, in my opinion. The government in China is full of people who completely understand the internet and what's happening and what's possible with tech, for better or for worse, and that is something that more people in Washington ought to spend some time thinking about.
If a young person listening or watching or in this room tonight wanted to try to emulate the career of journalists covering the convergence of tech and culture and everything else, given where the industry stands today, what advice would you give them?
A journalist?
Yeah. You mean to do what we do?
Exactly.
No, I was just going to say, major in English. I really do believe the liberal arts get a bad rap these days.
Yeah.
But I think be a curious person and don't be afraid to ask stupid questions and just go at it, you know?
Yeah.
And by the way, if you're a young person wanting to be a journalist, prepare to be an entrepreneur. You're going to have to create a job. You're not going to get a job in most cases.
Yeah,
You know,
interesting.
I was at Google I/O this morning, and you know, it was sort of amazing because you know so much of the journalism has been just decimated, with all these layoffs and things like that. Yet there must have been, I'm not kidding, like several hundred tech journalists. That field just keeps getting like bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's surprising. It's not over in terms of what we did. I could, without blinking, I could tell someone to go and do it. I mean, I don't know where you're going to be sitting in 10 years, but I'm pretty sure you'll have a job, and it'll be an interesting job.
But wait a minute. If everybody wants to do it, maybe it's not the right thing to do. That's another thing. I mean, I am distressed by how every journalist thinks they need to be a tech journalist now. I mean, because honestly,
Well, they'd like to
it isn't.
get some money for doing what
you
they're
got to. I don't know. I don't know what I'm saying here, but there's something wrong with. I mean, we all basically started doing it when it was a pretty unpopular thing to do.
The year was 1997.
Even when '91, when I started doing it, it was very unpopular to do.
If it wasn't
like
for
I said.
Monica Lewinsky in 1997, the press would have written about nothing but the internet. That was
Starting
the year
that
that
year,
the bit switched.
Because of what? Because of stock prices.
It was the bubble. Yeah. But
So it sounds like you're all saying a version of the same thing, which is be prepared to be entrepreneurial and create your own place in the world and
Well, they have
go
to. I mean,
for it.
they really, the journalism is going to be reinvented now. Even now, what you see in online isn't really native online. We're still, even the most advanced stuff is still half carrying on, the pure print thing, in an online form there. But someone, and I think it's going to happen in the next couple of years. I hope we do it at Wired. We have a new editor-in-chief, but there's going to be a reinvention of journalism that's native digital.
But I was absolutely shocked that the New York Times got away with what they got away with last year. We did Snowfall, which was this sort of new approach inside this media. How could the oldest of mainstream media, set the tone? What strikes me is the
And you got a Pulitzer for that too.
We did. We got a Pulitzer for it. I mean, how could that happen? I mean, all this new media sort of froth, and we got away with doing something that was fundamental. The joke about it around the Times is there were more lines of code in that project than were words of text. I mean, that's how things have flipped. And as a result, it was not daily journalism by any stretch of the imagination. That project took a half a year. So where are the tools that allow a single individual to operate at that level? I think at some point that will happen, but we're so far away from that. But that is obviously the direction I think how things have to move.
Great.
Future.
One final piece of advice I might give that young person is to move to China. I'm not kidding.
But they'll be censored.
Well, but they're going to figure out what's going on because they're going to see it in front of their eyes. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. Stephen Levy, John Markoff, David Kirkpatrick, thank you so much for being here tonight.
The writing careers of Levy, Markoff, and Kirkpatrick represent more than 250,000 books sold about the technology revolution from the inside. There are hundreds of stories like this at the Computer History Museum. Join us next time for the Computer History Museum presents Revolutionaries.